the new day. Let me ask everybody if you will look in your notebook and find the evaluation form, since a number of you may be leaving before the end of the conference this afternoon. Just wanted to remind all of you to please fill out that evaluation form. Evaluation is a critical part of our work, as I'm sure you know. So we are looking forward to getting your comments about the conference. So if you're leaving early, would you please fill out that evaluation form before you leave, and you can leave it with anybody here from the Blueprint staff or at the registration desk. Okay, you survived the night. I hope everybody is alert and ready for another great keynote address. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Bill Baccaglini. Bill is the president and CEO of the New York Foundling. He began his work actually 20 years in the New York state government, where he was involved in developing programs and policies relating to children, youth, and families. And in that time, he also was instrumental in creating the Office of Children and Family Services. He served as the director of the Office of Strategic Planning and Policy Development, and in that capacity again actually was instrumental in developing a new model for funding foster care and the New York State expansion of mental health services to children, families, and youth. He has 2 MAs, one from SUNY Albany and the other from North Carolina, Chapel Hill. As the director and CEO, president, and CEO of the foundation, he was responsible for helping to bring financial health really to the foundation and to expanding the foundation's focus into foster care funding and into prevention services. And in that latter capacity, he has been a real champion for evidence-based practices. So it gives me pleasure to introduce to you Bill Baccaglini.
I'm gonna stay down here, folks. It's just a little bit more comfortable and seems more like a conversation. Thank you, Dr. Elliott. First, I know that the 2 speakers yesterday, Bob and Brian, thanked Dr. Elliott for his vision and the work that they've done here in Colorado. And I'm not even so sure that they were kind enough. I was just sharing with Dr. Elliott that back when I was in graduate school for the dissertation that I never finished at SUNY Albany, one of the pieces of work that I read that struck me as a conversation changer was a piece that he had done in the 80s with Adjuton, and it looked at it attempted, in fact, I think the title may have had reconciling in the title. They compared official crime statistics with self-report as part of the National Youth Survey, and actually found that the race effects didn't go away fully, but started to go away. And I think that piece led a lot of us to start to question, in fact, because at that point, official statistics were what we had to assess where we were. And so I'm very, very thankful for that. But that's selfishly because you kept me awake one night reading your article. I'm really here to thank you, though, on behalf of all the folks in the audience and the thousands of kids across this country, because as a result of you having raised the bar and suggesting that tomorrow can be brighter than yesterday, I'm not so sure they'd be in the situation that they are. So on behalf of all of us, I really want to thank you and the people here at Colorado. Well, when Keller Struther from MST, an old friend, when he called me up and he said, listen, would you do this? I'm thinking, now Keller's a friend, and I'm thinking, now, why would he? So I said, Keller, why do you want me to do that? And he gave me a bunch of BS and blah, 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 which was really, as it turns out, code for somebody who made some of the crazy decisions you did and are still around to talk about it deserves to talk about it. So I said okay, because he is an old friend. He and Scott, we go back some time, as I'll share in my presentation this morning. But it's seriously, why Keller did ask me, and it's important to put this out, unlike the two speakers yesterday. I'm going to kind of give you a case study. Keller wants me to talk about specifically the New York experience and what we did and how it evolved and where it currently stands. So you may be required, even though it's early in the morning, you may be required to be a bit more of an active listener, because context is important. And I'm going to talk to you about the New York context. I don't know the context in Michigan. I don't know the context in Louisiana. I don't know the context in Mississippi. So you have to overlay what I'm saying to you. And I'll point out where I think is uniquely New York. Like, not many states and cities have their bridges closed by a neighboring state, right? So you probably don't share that, right? So, but where I think things are transferable, I'll point them out. Where things are unique, I'll not. So who is this for? I'd like to think I can speak to both, or actually all three, but primarily policymakers and providers. Practitioners somewhat, but because I'm a clinician, I tend to stay away from advising. Sylvia makes sure I never even see a family at the Foundling. Policymakers and providers are actually my target audience. And really, what I'd like to do, I'd actually like you to leave with more questions than you came in with. Now, I'm very, very good at that, not answering anybody's questions and getting them to walk away with those that I consider important. But I think in this particular instance, I think we're at a critical juncture here, because I think we have to ask ourselves a lot of questions. We're just about 20 years into what I think has been an unbelievably great experiment, project, whatever word you might use it. But I think we have to ask some serious questions. Where do we go from here? Are we where we want to be? And if we're not where we want to be, how do we get there? And so that's what I'd like to do. So back to 1998. That's when basically it all started. The governor had just created the Office of Children and Family Services. I had been with the state's Division for Youth, which obviously the Justice Agency. We were combining with the Child Welfare section of the New York State Department of Social Services. I was lucky. My boss, the Division for Youth director, was named the commissioner of the new agency. So it is who you know. So I was appointed the Director of Strategic Planning and Policy Development at OCFS. And so we had our new neighbors, right? Our new neighbors were coming over from the social services side of the house, and we were all excited about inviting them in. And it wasn't long into the creation of the agency that one of the analysts brings into me unbelievably elegant one-pager summarizing the recidivism studies over 25 years for kids who were in the Division for Youth and had been discharged. 25 years. I think it was 4 studies summarizing 25, all on one page. I mean, it was really, really elegant. And here's the good news. The good news is it was unbelievably consistent. You'd think that we baked the books. The bad news is we would have never baked them this way. I was shocked. I sat and, you have those aha moments. And I'm sitting in my office and I see across 25 years, 4 distinct studies, the same measures. We were very, very good at doing we weren't very good at treating kids, I guess, but we were very, very good at doing recidivism studies. And I'm telling you that the rearrest, and Stephen Felipe talked yesterday about having some suspicions about recidivism data. And when you're trying to compare across jurisdictions, it's apples and oranges. But this was our own work over 25 years, so it was unbelievably consistent, all the same measures. And it didn't range. The rearrest rates for kids leaving the Division for Youth between 1975 and 1995 did not go lower than 79 and did not go higher than 82. That's where they were. And we looked at everything. You look at arrest leading to conviction, conviction leading to incarceration. And, I just sat back and said, gosh, I'm getting old. I've been in the business for an awfully long time. Right at that point, in 1998, I joined the Division for Youth in 1982, and I'm looking at this. So besides the fact that we fired the analyst for summarizing my whole career on one page. We were a little embarrassed for our new friends, right? The social services folks that had just joined the agency. And so what we did is we scoured and scoured and scoured the literature. I swear that Martinson book from the 70s is on my damn bookcase, and I tried to burn it 10 times, and it would never light. It would never light. And it was depressing as hell. And so I sent, actually, Sylvia, who's with me at the Foundling now and was with me in Albany. We started to look pretty significantly into, can we change this? Now, think about it, though, folks. And here's where context is important for you all. It's 1998 in New York. We have a pretty conservative governor, not a Tea Party nut, but a pretty conservative governor. Okay? We have a juvenile offender law, fewer tougher in the country. We're an age of criminality at 16. We in progressive North Carolina share that distinction. Okay? And we hadn't met a residential bed we didn't like. So you put all those things together, change wasn't going to come from within. Right? We had banged our head on the wall, and it seemed like people were pretty comfortable. Oh, another recidivism study in, 79%, down from 80. Okay, another 4 years, we'll run it back up. So change wasn't going to come from within. I was pretty clear on that. And so we had to get change to come from outside. And here's a strategic decision. And I'll try to point these out as I did. Whether it has relevance for where you are will be for you to decide. So we discovered the blueprints. The ink had not yet been dry, right, or only had been dry for a year or two. And we actually, and you go to a lot of conferences. This is a valuable one, but I'm sure you've been to the share of them where you think, God, why did I go to that conference? We decided to hold a conference inviting the three most well-known at that point evidence-based practices, FFT, MST, and MTFC, to Albany. That doesn't sound like a big deal. For us, and here's what it did. Here's why it was important strategically. Knowing that I had to change the system from without. In the justice world, in most states, not all, but in most states, the power base is at the state. The state systems generally are in charge of justice because, a murder here in that county is the same as murder in another county. So the state has a much bigger role in justice. In New York State, interestingly, we're one of 11, or we were at that point. I don't know if any of the states have changed. We're in the social services world where state supervised but county administered. So we have 50-something counties in New York State where there's actually local power on the child welfare side. So I'm thinking, maybe I can use these people as a source of support because little did they know, but they actually, the child welfare and the social services people in New York actually pay for the juvenile justice care in the facilities because of the way the state funds things. So I could actually stir that pot a little bit. So we strategically invited all the social service commissioners thinking that if they liked what they heard, they'd go back and they'd start to say, boy, this doesn't make sense. $250,000 a year for a kid in a residential care when I just heard that FFT can do X, Y, or Z. So we invited all other agency commissioners, Commissioner of Mental Health, because if you look at if you read the clinical studies, mental health, very, very applicable. The Division of Budget, for those of you thinking about getting it, have the money folks at the table, because they they'll talk about program and all that stuff. They want to save money. A dollar that they don't have to give you is a dollar they can give to somebody else. So we strategically put together this conference, and it was held over a couple of days, and it really, the results from it were remarkable. The legs that it produced. It was very focused. Every attendant was there, had to attend an MTFC session, FFT session, and an MST session. You had no choice. If you were coming to the conference, this is what you had to do. And we also set up kind of like I shouldn't really say this, but I had gotten some pressure to have a local New York program there, a New York State program. So I resisted at first, but then I'm thinking, this is probably not so bad. I'll bring in this New York program. Good guy. They did some decent stuff. But after folks walk away and see the rigor with which these best practices go about their work, and they see the local work, maybe then they'll start to see that maybe there's something else outside the borders of New York. So that's the conference. So gets some legs. We hear some hutter. We get phone calls. The Division of Budget likes it. The Division of Budget likes it. And so now I think we're starting to change the conversation a little bit. But that's still my goal, just to get the conversation changed. So I approached the governor's office. Well, the budget office. They don't let me upstairs. I approached the Division of Budget and said, listen, I want to use MST, knowing that the budget head had sat through the MST session. And MST at that point probably had a more developed business model at that point, and clearly a bit more intensive than FFT, right? The contacts, there's all those, and I don't want to get into the nuances of the models, but a little bit more intensive. So we were going to go with that. But there's no way they were going to let me do it as an alternative, right? It's 1998. It's an election year. This is a pretty conservative state. Don't be fooled by the recent mayoral election in New York City. There's from a justice perspective, this is a pretty conservative state. So the Division of Budget's thinking, well, why don't we just take a few months off the back end of their stay? We can do it quietly. Nobody will know, right? We'll send these kids at those costs that you heard Bob talk about yesterday, that Commissioner Carrion gave them, right? It doesn't take long for the money to add up. So that was the best deal I could get. I wasn't going to get an alternative. It just wasn't going to happen in that kind of context. So you have to know your context. So the next thing was to approach MST. And I have to tell you, this was, if it wasn't funny, it would have been funny. I go to Scott Hengler. We actually go down to South Carolina, to Charleston. And I said, okay, here's what we got. Now, I'd met everybody because we had this big conference, right? And the fact of the matter is they liked the fact that they got into New York and maybe there'd be some business. You know, we all understand that. So I said with Scott and Keller, and I said, here's what I want to do. I got permission to cut some months off the back end of a kid's stay in this residential facility and then use MST afterwards. So Scott says, let me see after his ha 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 ha. He says, let me see if I understand this. Let me see if I understand this. You want to take my family-based, community-based intervention and apply it to a kid who's had all those ties severed, been sent to a facility with a bunch of other kids who have all those ties severed, let them talk among each other for months, bring them back, and you want me to do MST? And I said, yeah, that's exactly what we want to do. So we had a few chuckles over it. He thought it was nuts. We actually, and here's another thing, and here's where I'm going to get back to the context. We knew this was not a great decision when we made it, but we were starting from scratch. We had to change the conversation. We were starting from scratch. So we wound up doing MST. So nothing happens. There's no New York Post headlines, no Daily News headlines, so things are going, I'll tell you the results in a few minutes. Thank God I was at Albany by the time they were published. So we also, over the next few years, got FFT in, and we brought MTFC in. Now, MTFC was big to bring into the city because that was used, you know what MTFC is, a foster care model. So we actually started to now change the venue. So the Division of Budget's getting a little excited. They're seeing the numbers add up, the savings add up, no headlines, so things are going okay. At the same time this is happening, I get invited down to the Casey Foundation in Baltimore with Scott and all the other developers, and Casey's considering underwriting the developers to sit around for 10, 12, 15 years and talk about how to integrate their models. And I remember Patrick McCarthy in Baltimore, and I said, Patrick, this isn't that complicated, please. You have FFT, you have MST, you have MTFC, there's a continuum there, we'll figure this thing out, but no. That's why the Casey's Casey. They're very thoughtful, they go about their work very judiciously. So, but that conversation's going on. A few years later, Scott, Patty, and Jim Alexander emerge from this dark room, and they say, we have a model. And so they bring it to New York for a couple of reasons. Scott, we had a relationship, and we were fortunate enough at that time to have John Mattingly as the commissioner of ACS. So that's going on. That's 98. 2003, I now leave. All the conversations with Baltimore are over. I'm now in New York at the Foundling. The Foundling's a $115 million organization, 1,700 staff. We have on any given day 700 kids in foster care. We provide preventive services to 600 families, and we provide Head Start services to 1,200 families in Puerto Rico. So it's pretty well established, opened its doors in 1869. So I'm lucky enough to get an opportunity after what I did in Albany to come down and take over the Foundling. I get out before the MST evaluation is in, so everything's okay. So now we're in New York, and let me say this to you folks. I know it's fun, or people sometimes are fond of coming to conferences like this and being critical of the systems that they work in. I can't be more positive about the child welfare system in New York City. I don't think it's ever been stronger. We have our issues, but I don't think it's ever been stronger. And I think we owe that to about 10 or 12 years of pretty forward-thinking leadership, starting with John Mattingly, who came in from Casey, as smart a guy as you ever want to meet, understood practice at the street level better than almost anybody. So it was ripe. The Bloomberg administration, very, very big on the metric, very, very big on accountability. So everybody had to step up their game. Again, I'll get into where I think we should have done some things differently in New York City. But generally speaking, in my 32 years in the business, the child welfare system in New York City, to my mind, has never been stronger. We have about 11,000 kids in foster care today. Now, that may sound like a lot. In 1990, we had 47,000 kids in foster care. I think we have to go back to 75 or 76 for the last time that we had so few kids in foster care. So I think it's a good system. We have our problems, we make our mistakes, but I think it's a good system. So, okay. John Mattingly, and he's at the end of the day, he's as programmatically oriented as you can get, but he also has a budget to run. So he's there for a few years, and while I wouldn't call Commissioner Mattingly a cheerleader, a flag waver for evidence-based practices, he was very open to innovation because he understood that we needed to improve practice. So he was very, very, very receptive to innovation. And he came from Casey, right? So he came from Casey. He's back at Casey now. He came from Casey. So he understood that. And he understood, too, more than anything else, that we as a state, New York, had overvalued residential care. I mean, for years and years and years, we'd put kids in residential care and produce the results that I just told you about a few minutes ago. So one of the smartest things that he did, beyond just being receptive to innovation, actually, in John's number 2, Belinda Conway is at the conference today and probably in the room here today, another champion for this. What they did is they permitted innovation, but probably the single greatest thing he did to move the evidence-based needle is he started a juvenile justice initiative. Now, remember, he's only a child welfare agency. He started a juvenile justice initiative. I can't say all good things about it. No, this is good. It's just from a business standpoint. He realized all the money he's actually paying, right, that they're sending him, that he's actually paying for these juvenile justice placements upstate. And the numbers are not insignificant. When you're in New York City, you produce 65% of the kids in state care. So he's thinking, wait a minute, I know they don't produce good results. It's now on my dime, things have to change. So he brought over, probably in the last 5 or 6 years, the 2 greatest champions of evidence-based practice, particularly on the justice side. And we'll get to child welfare later, a bit more complicated. But on the justice side, he brought over Ron Richter, who ultimately would be his successor and be the commissioner at ACS after John left. And Ron brought Leslie Abbey with him. These 2 folks took on the JJI like nobody's business. That was happening at the same time that, again, Scott and company emerged from the back office with this model. And so it was time to move forward. They called John. They said, let's go to the Foundling. Let's go to the Foundling on this because they're used to evidence-based practice and they know the conversation. And thus we started Blue Sky. We didn't yet start the clinical trial because we had to negotiate some things with the district attorneys and all sorts of things. But today in New York, we have a clinical trial. Actually, and I mean a clinical trial. There hasn't been one in 35 years in the city. And there are kids appearing before Judge Smith this morning. Maybe not this morning, but you get my drift. Appearing before a judge this morning, and the judge is making a determination, not knowing whether that kid is going to that facility or he's going to go to Blue Sky and get whatever Sylvia and her team assess his or her needs are. So it's real live. The city had a lot of courage to do it, right? The New York Post is always looking for headlines, always looking for headlines. So we're in the midst of a clinical trial in the city. In fact, the trial, the N has now been satisfied, so now it's doing the program and just waiting for the results. So we have Blue Sky going down the road, garnering a lot of attention, and we have Leslie and Ron Richter, and Josh, I should also mention Josh, who was with Leslie, moving the JJI. Oh, I haven't told her. Carla said I haven't told everybody what Blue Sky. Okay, Blue Sky. Blue Sky is an attempt to integrate FFT, MST, and MTFC. Okay? It's along a continuum. You know things aren't going right when most of the folks are in MTFC, right? Because then you haven't succeeded along the line. So really you want most of the kids in FFT on the front end. FFT is not the right model. You move to MST, and then if you actually do need a respite, you need residential care, you go to MTFC. So we're right in the middle of that now. Okay. So now they're starting to feel their sea legs in New York City, and it's time to tackle the child welfare world. And here's what happened. We actually liked the way FFT behaved. I don't mean Jim Alexander's behavior. I actually mean the conduct of the intervention itself. We loved the way that it behaved in Blue Sky. And so we called Jim and Doug and said, listen, you guys, all of the intellectual underpinnings, there's no reason why this couldn't work in the child welfare world. Just no reason. Family engagement, focus on caregiver, not the kid. This is ripe for child welfare. And folks, child welfare are where the numbers are, right? The ratio in most mature systems is about 15 to 1. Child welfare is where, they talked before yesterday about the school to prison pipeline. We have child welfare to justice pipeline. So if you can get into child welfare, you stop an awful lot of this. So we sat with Jim and Doug, and we actually, using FFT as the foundation, modified FFT, and we called it FFTCW for child welfare. So we take FFTCW. Now we're, I think, the city's second largest preventive provider. And we have to be careful on this stuff too. So we took it to one of our we have an office in each borough, and we took it to one of our regions up in Harlem, and we actually started to do FFTCW there. Well, Sylvia, do you want to? Yeah, let me share with folks here. So this is the fine work that the JJI initiative wound up doing. Look at the New York City JD placements from 2007 up to 2012, right? A little over 1,000 to just about 400. The JD placements then go to, we'll now discuss some of the results from Blue Sky. Now, if this isn't enough to get you to change, these are the results of Blue Sky prior to the clinical trial. The clinical trial faculty will not, I have a gag order, I am not allowed to speak about the clinical trial, but remember, we were operating for a couple of years before the trial started. Look at the difference in arrests, 33 and 41 in felony, and look at the cost savings. That's criminal. And pardon the pun on that, but that's criminal. Think about that. And when you use the numbers given yesterday, right, by Bob, it approaches $48 million, the savings in just 5 years of treating kids in the community. Okay, so now to FFTCW. So we go to North Manhattan, and these are the results that were produced, and we are ecstatic about this. The 2 points that you should focus on, or the 3 points, are the referral to another service provider, 18% and less than 1% if you got our care. The length of stay over on the right-hand side, 21 months down to almost 7 months, and the cost savings up above $6,700. Okay? So these are families that have been identified by ACS as having a problem. They're formally in the ACS preventive system. And these are the results. And it's small, right? For us, it's 100 and something. For the city, it's a lot. The comparison is 9,000 cases. So, and I'm going to comment a little bit later about we need to move this into child welfare. And you look at this, and we have no reason to believe, and we're evaluating this now because we've rolled it out into all our other. So in New York City, we are using FFTCW for every family receiving preventive services, and that's 600 families because we believe in it. Okay. Where are we on this now? We have FFTCW, no clinical trial, fairly systematic, fairly thorough, complicated evaluation. What are some of the lessons learned from both the justice and our child welfare experience in New York City and evidence-based practice? The justice stuff, ACS deserves an awful lot of credit for. Leslie and Ron, actually, we've reached a critical mass as an alternative. Evidence-based, the number of kids going through court, not making it to the end and getting diverted, getting evidence-based practices, quite frankly, that's the New York City miracle that we've actually gotten. And we haven't gotten a critical mass in a lot of other places. We're at a critical mass there. So much so that we had to extend the time period of the clinical trial. Because remember, the clinical trial is for the kids who were otherwise going to go to residential care. The funnel was getting narrower and narrower and narrower, and then not enough kids were coming through. Sylvia's over there mad because it messes up the clinical trial, but that's good news, right? We should celebrate that. So we had to extend the time period in the clinical trial just to get enough kids. So ACS appropriately deserves an unbelievable amount of credit for having brought evidence-based practice in to a juvenile justice system and actually reaching a critical mass. I think I understand where we've made some problems in the child welfare world. And that hasn't been as easy. And I think here's why. In the justice world, ACS could make these decisions, sign contractors up, and if the youngsters failed, it never really came back and touched their system. The kids would wind up somewhere else. Right? So in other words, they could provide the workers, but if something went wrong, those failures, so to speak, wouldn't come back into their system. So quite frankly, they had the luxury of actually operating JJI to some extent outside the rest of their big monster system. Remember, this is a system that has now only 11,000 kids in care, but 35,000 families receiving preventive services, running daycare for the whole city. So it's a big social services system. The justice stuff was just a slice. So they didn't have to confront a lot of other things they were going to have to confront organizationally as they attempted to move into the child welfare world, which quite frankly I think the Foundling can take some credit for because we pushed this FFTCW. So, lesson learned. Great job on the juvenile justice, evidence-based. They've reached critical mass. No impact on their infrastructure. Child welfare, we're getting there. I think if you asked them if they had to do all over again, what would they do? I think they would have taken a timeout, looked at their own infrastructure and make sure it's consistent with the expectations of the evidence-based practices. I mean, actually today, we run MTFC on the justice side of the house and on the child welfare side of the house. And I'm not going to overstate it and say the rules are radically different, but the rules are different. So we adhere to two different sets of rules. And that's something even the city's, not comfortable with. And I think we'll get there. I think in an ideal world, the city probably would have had the folks in from Chapel Hill, right? The National Implementation Research Network, probably a little bit sooner. They're in there now. And they've been in there. Allison Metz, who I guess I'm on a panel with after this, she's in there now. I think if the city was being honest with you, getting their own bureaucracy ready for this sooner before it went to scale would have been the smart thing to do. But so what? That's I can ding them a little bit for that, but that's a small. We'll get there. And actually, you could make an argument. I don't know if it stands up with all these smart people around here, but you could make an argument that by doing it this way, it's messy out of the gate, but when it gets there, it's probably a stronger system. And you don't change those things you don't have to. But the child welfare stuff is just a bit more complicated. So, Sylvia, after FFTCW, we have things that you should remember, and I'll go through this quickly because I know time is getting short, and I really want to get to the challenges because I think we have our share of them, all of us. Don't oversell. Perfect, another Hengler conversation. These things are not magic bullets, and if you oversell, you're only going to set yourself up for disappointment. And it's one thing to be disappointed. It's something else to have somebody, a budget person, pull the rug out from under you because you told them you were going to do this and you're only able to do that, and that's measured in money to them. So be careful about overselling. MST was a perfect example. When we spoke to Scott and Keller, when we first started this, Scott said, listen, here's what I'm promising. Here's not what I'm promising. You do this right. You do this with fidelity. I'll cut your recidivism rate in half. That's pretty good. Well, that's pretty good. So he's going to cut it from 80 to 40. But that still means I'm going to have a 40% recidivism rate. So he's not selling this. Right? He didn't push this. This is your elixir bill. You wave this magic wand and recidivism is going to go from 80 to nothing. He said, I'll cut it in half. And if I cut it in half, we should all have a parade and celebrate. And think about the money from before. If you're able to cut the recidivism rate from 80 to 40, think about the money generated there. So you can't oversell. And listen, the more confidence you have wherever you are in the evolution within your jurisdiction, the more you can oversell. You're just starting out. Don't oversell. Interventions are not substitutes for relationships. I think the biggest mistake we made in New York City when we took FFTCW actually into the Foundling's traditional work, because even for the Foundling, justice was a sidebar. When Sylvia came down and we did Blue Sky, Sylvia, I saw her once or twice a month. She had her group down there, and they actually operated independently of the Foundling. But now we're going into child welfare. This is the Foundling's real work. God, we made some mistakes. I can't tell you all of the safety calls I got from the city. Safety because child safety, young kids being in foster care. Just because of the way we sold this. I think we didn't market this the right way. And this is for you folks who run provider agencies. This is not a replacement for relationships. At the end of the day, you're going to be able to affect change with the people you work with as a result of your relationship. What it is tools to advance your relationship, tools to make your relationship better, tools, I think, more importantly, to make your relationship a focused one. But it's not a substitute. And I actually think we lost some good staff because they said, geez, I went and got my MSW. I think I know what I'm doing. And Bill Baccaglini comes in with FFT and MST and saying this is it as a replacement for what they had learned to do. It's not. So be very, very careful about that. Cultural sensitivity issue. I heard this yesterday. Let me say this to you guys. I've been in the business a long time. I did this stuff in government. I've been at this great, great, great institution for almost 11 years now. When you combine the 600 families and the 700 kids in foster care, the population's 98% non-white. New York is like a small UN. Well, actually, Queens is the UN. The rest of the boroughs, not so much. But I have looked at this and looked at this and looked at this and just don't find any legitimacy to the claim. I actually do think, and this isn't that easy to say, but I actually do think some folks, and actually I hear it less from the folks you'd think you'd hear it from, but some administrators use this as a reason not to move forward. And I've looked at this stuff 6 and 7 different ways. I just don't see it. It may be somewhere in the stuff I've seen. It doesn't. I haven't seen it exist. The next one, modification to the programs. I guess, and Dr. Elliott, I think, is going to spend some time on this, and I heard others talk about this before yesterday about modifying it. Right? Look at FFTCW is not a best practice. It's not a promising practice. Right? We took FFT, we modified it, and we're in the process of evaluating it. But right now, it's just an offshoot of FFT with some pretty strong intellectual underpinnings, but it's not a best practice. You modify it. If you do modify a program, you don't do it without the developers. Yeah, any modifications to a program, you have to include the developers. First of all, just out of respect. So this is their intellectual property, right? So you just don't go ahead and modify. Strategically engaging stakeholders. I would not, they'd never asked me to write a textbook on this. I'm pretty tactical on when to involve people. I think there are some real limits to democracy on this stuff. When I was up in Albany and we talked about that conference and knowing that change would have to come from outside, I didn't sit down before we set this whole up with the Division of Budget in the Governor's office. Well, what do you think about this? You got to know when to bring people into the discussion. Now, that doesn't mean everything is top down, but I think you have to be strategic. I think you have to be very, very strategic, because if you're not, and you go public and by public I don't mean the big P, but you go public too soon, and you don't have all your T's crossed and I's dotted, there will be ways to undermine the effort. In fact, I think later when we get to challenges, we'll talk about how even providers undermine this and impede it because my child's different. God, if I've heard my kid's different once, I've heard it 4 million times. Your kids may be different, but not different on those attributes that are important for these outcomes. But they may be, yeah, my daughter's different than your daughter. I'm sure she is. But at the end of the day, those differences really don't matter here. So be very strategic about where you need help. Be strategic about how you enlist it. The next takes longer than you think. There's really not much else to it. Does. And I don't know why you analyze why it takes longer, but it does. The more I thought that everything has been so well thought out, things still take longer. So I don't say double it, but give yourself some cushion, depending upon where you're starting from. Now, if you want to add an FFT team and you already have 5 or 6, that's one thing. You want to start MST from scratch, that's quite another. And you know what? Here's the other thing. And here's the thing about with your staff. For both policymakers and providers, let them know out of the gate, they're going to be better next year than they are this year at it. And they're going to be better in 3 years than they were in 2 years. This stuff takes some time. But also, strategically, from a leverage standpoint, from your perspective, if you're an administrator, is, listen, we now find out that our staff turnover is starting to slow because they see these as portable skills. Right now you're imparting to them skills that they wouldn't otherwise have had you not been involved in evidence-based practice. So I think that's critical. Okay, we're just about getting to wrap up, and this is actually where I wanted to spend most of my time. And this is where I don't intend to offend anybody or rattle too many cages unnecessarily, but I think that, as I said before, I think it's important that we have a conversation about this stuff. If you guys think about our penetration, 2, 10%, 2 in child welfare, 10 in justice, even raise it to 15. That's okay with me. Raise it to 15. We've been at this for this amount of time. Justice is easy. Let me tell you, compared to child welfare, juvenile justice is very, very easy. Fewer points of decision, not very rich regulatorily, right? Very few regulations. You have to get very few stakeholders around the table. They're prickly stakeholders. The justice stakeholders tend to be more prickly than the child welfare ones, but there's not a lot of them. The decision points are pretty straightforward. Generally, one level of government controls most of the action. And still, at the end of the day, here's where we are. And you saw my blue sky results. And you could have done it. You could have done it. I mean, it's not anything. Well, Sylvia, I'm sorry. Sylvia did it. But no, the point is, this could be done anywhere. We had the privilege and opportunity because of a relationship with the developers to do it. But you could do it. It's not magic. It's not rocket science. If you pay attention, if you do it with fidelity, you can do it. Look at the results it's produced, and yet look at the penetration where we are. Here's the interesting thing about justice, and for those just starting out or looking to move it into your justice system if it's not there already. In justice, there are actually cultural impediments and not structural ones. And here's what I mean. You can get through the structures pretty easy, right? You have to meet with the head DA here. You have to meet with the judge. You got to get legal aid in. But there's a few folks around the table, and the judges, quite frankly, across most of the country, not all, are starving for something different to do. So structurally, not a lot of impediments in justice. Culturally, though, right, this paramilitary organizations, very, very vertical. It's on the street where the justice folks might push back, because that's not their approach, the give and the take. I'm a probation officer. I just want to check that Johnny was home last night, as opposed to being the agent of change in Johnny's life. And that's not all probation officers, and I think that's starting to change. But the fact of the matter is the resistance you'll get on the justice side of the house is more likely to be from the rank and file, that this is a big change. Truth be told, when I was up in Albany, remember I told you we put out MST, and we used all voluntary providers. In fact, Mona from Children's Village is here. We chose Children's Village. I didn't RFP it. I'm starting from scratch in Albany in 1998, and I'm going to put out an RFP and see who wins? Hell no. I had a lot at stake. I handpicked the providers who were going to do it because we had an awful lot at stake. That's not good government. You can't go to scale that way, but at this particular point, that's what we had to do. So our staff, actually going back to 1998, our aftercare staff from the justice side of the house, we just told them, check in on the kids, check in. The program providers were the voluntary agencies, the clinical agents of change. And that's because we just didn't want to get into that potential pushback. Child welfare, totally different, and it's going to take years to get there, but we have to start because of the ratios I talked about. Rich regulations, right? The regulatory environment in child welfare is maddening, right? The feds have a handle in it because feds are in for 50 cents on every dollar of foster care, so they have a handle on it. And child safety, right? Child safety is the underpinning of any good child welfare system, and we need to pay attention to that. But interestingly, in child welfare, it'll be the structural barriers, and it won't be the rank and file. Because if you can get in the door, and I think with these numbers you can get in the door, if you can get in the door, you'll find the rank and file. They're open arms for a lot of this stuff, right? It's what they want to be about. They want to engage the families. They want to engage the caregivers, right? So you're not going to get you won't have the cultural problems in child welfare. You'll have the structural ones. So you need to be careful. Okay. So that as a précis to our challenges. I know what I want to say. I just want to make sure I use the right words. Getting to scale and sustainability, I'll talk about together. As I raised before in our opening about the challenges, we have a lot of them, right? We're now almost 20 years in, and we can't even use the word saturation, right? Even if it's in degrees of, when it's that low, you don't talk of saturation. And yet the data are unequivocal that these models work. So what do we do? And I try to understand, why is it that penetration, and let's face it, let's stay on the justice for a second. If we can't penetrate in this environment in justice, something's wrong. On what other issue, and particularly since the financial crisis of 2008, on what other issues have you seen Republicans and Democrats come together? Listen, when I was 40, I cared about motives. I'm 60, I don't give a damn what motivates people as long as they do the right thing, right? So you have the Republicans meeting the Democrats talking about, this stuff's expensive, $260,000 in New York to do this for a year, and the Democrats saying, yeah, and look at the results it produces. 80% recidivism. So they're having the conversation. They're having the conversation. So if we can't strike now and grow this at this point, I'll tell you, and this is and you know it's tough because those of you who know Dr. Elliott's career, I mean, I could live 10 lives and not have a career like that. But at some point, and I think we're the soldiers, at some point, the shelf life. I don't think anybody could say it's 15 years, it's 20 years, it's 25, it's 30. I don't know. I don't have any insight into that you wouldn't have. But there's an end, right? At some point, I mean, think about how quickly Apple changes and Microsoft changes when market share levels out. Think about where we are in justice on this. So there is a shelf life. I don't know what it is, but I think that Dr. Elliott talked yesterday about you'd leave here as ambassadors. We need to be more than ambassadors. And this may not strike everybody as the right thing to do. In justice, not child welfare, but in justice, I would welcome a moratorium on development for 10 years and put every damn dollar into marketing. I actually would. I think we have these programs. We know what works. I'll go back to the two speakers yesterday. I actually think we have them. We just haven't marketed them. We just haven't been able to penetrate and get it out there and get folks to understand. And I'm not quite so sure why. I have my suspicions, and I'll get into what I think what my suspicions are. But I'll take a moratorium. I can't afford a moratorium on child welfare. I think there needs to be more FFTCWs, but I'll take a moratorium on more development in the justice world. Lord knows, if $50 million over 5 years, over 225 kids isn't enough, God, I don't know. I don't know what else somebody would want. So I think we need to market, and who do we have to market to? Mark's last slide yesterday, I think, there was a quip from Patrick McCarthy on the bottom, but above it, it talked about the public systems. At the end of the day, you got to engage the public systems, or else you're just going to be one-off. You got to get the public systems engaged. If the public systems don't buy in, this thing is going to be a boutique at best going forward. The public systems have to buy into this. The developers. And you know, I've tried to analyze why we are where we are with penetration rates. And, you know, I'm playing in my head that maybe after the Inc. ride, we were so excited, the results were so overwhelming that we just thought people would naturally come, and maybe we sat back for a little bit thinking, here they are, everybody come and get it, and that didn't happen. And then maybe after a few years when that didn't happen, the developers themselves took it on and pursued it. And you know what? At the end of the day, and I love the developers. I have a great relationship with all of them. I mean, Patty Chamberlain had to be dragged kicking and screaming out of Eugene, Oregon to come to New York City for this stuff. I mean, these folks are academics, right? They're academics at the end of the day. MST, pretty robust business model. FFT, an increasingly robust business model. But at the end of the day, they're idea folks. This notion of going to scale is really not in their DNA. Plus, you're the mayor of Detroit. Keller Strother knocks on your door and says, I have MST to sell you. He's got skin in the game. So his credibility with the mayor of Detroit, of course you think your intervention works best. So it's a complication. It's a complication, but I think it's one that a bunch of smart people have to get around a table and talk about. Because I don't think, let me say this to you, I'm not sure of a lot of things. I don't think, with respect to growing, we can afford to have the next 15 years like the last 15 years, or we're not sitting around talking about it. So what do? I clearly think this idea of an intermediary, and it's a nice term, it actually sounds nice to say, an intermediary. What does that actually mean? It sounds a little covert in some ways. But I think here, an intermediary organization, and I'll mention one that MST has worked out a relationship with. Here's what I think it does. I think we need folks who know how to implement at the same time that we protect the developer's intellectual property. So you create agencies or organizations whereby Doug Kopp, Jim Alexander, Scott Hengler, Patty Chandler, everybody, whoever, whatever intervention it is, where they maintain a very close handle on training and clinical support, because that's the quality assurance, and that's the fidelity, and that's the intellectual property. But that there's intermediaries, I think, probably of provider agencies who have done it, that will have more credibility walking into a new jurisdiction. So I think the combination involves an organization where the developers are still involved, but if we leave it, I mean, have a conversation with Keller. I mean, I spend a lot of time with them. And they are, without a doubt, the most robust model. And ask him about their penetration and what their numbers look like here. I mean, Europe is a different story, as it is with FFT and even MTFC. But talk about penetration here. It's not there. So I actually think that we need some intermediaries. And I think that, I mean, I would point to Dr. Elliott, Sharon, to be the center for all this stuff and to convene us, because I think that there's a selfless legitimacy attached to them that might not be attached to me and might not be attached to Keller. Sustainability. Here's where I'm going to turn the intermediary upside down. Two things on sustainability. I talked before about marketing to the public entities. If we don't get to the public entities, we're done. But the public entities have to think about this as systems change. Brian was right yesterday. If we're here in 10 years talking about evidence-based practice as individual programs, we've lost. Evidence-based practice is an approach to your work, right? It's a way of thinking. It's an organizing principle. So we don't want to talk about individual therapies. So sustainability is going to actually be tied to the extent to which public agencies, ACS, brings in Allison, right, and actually works with them to actually make the culture of the public agency consistent with the expectations of the evidence-based practices it wants to employ. At the same time, the providers. God, the Foundling we made, I should have been fired for the number of mistakes we made in getting started, right? Once we came into the child welfare world and we thought we could do this as a one-off, like we did in justice as a sidebar, and found out we were mistaken, then we discovered we used the community development team out of California. That's for a provider agency actually to come in and make sure that their culture of their organization is receptive to the kinds of expectations. So these things are out there. I think we have to be a little assertive and aggressive at pursuing them, but they're clearly out there. My last, is it time for my last? You guys probably thought it was time for my last. I do? Okay. The use of non-blueprint programs. This is sensitive and complicated. I've just stood up here for, 35, 40 minutes talking to you about how I'm a believer in evidence-based practice. And yet, I'm doing FFTCW. And if Dr. Elliott, he wouldn't, said to me, well, you got to choose, brother. Either you're in or you're out. I like FFTCW. Right? Now, I've done some things that others haven't. We've built in an evaluation plan to it, a pretty sophisticated one. But let me say this to you. I resent a little. I love my parents dearly. My dad's 92 and my mom's 88, and they still live at home and they still drive around. I love them dearly, but on many levels, I resent the fact that the time, the money, and the consideration for what medication they might take and the options they might take at their age for osteo, let's just say osteo, and their options, right, and all the time and thought and money went into developing these good options for them. I resent that that's okay with folks, but we don't need to dedicate those sorts of resources to a 14-year-old boy who may have been born to a drug addict and an abusive father and whose next bad decision may cost him 15 years of his life. Right? There's a disconnect there for me. There's a disconnect there for me. So I get nervous when the conversation starts to focus on moving away from the evidence-based practices. On the other hand, I'm a practical guy. Right? I have an agency to run. FFTCW feels good. Those results seem pretty decent. We'll see what the research says. So I think we have to have the conversation. I'm not enamored. There's a lot of buzz around these conferences about, the SPIP and Mark Lipsey's work, and God, Lord knows, he's got an IQ of about 10 million. But I'm not so sure clinical models need to be picked apart to look at their individual attributes. I'm not so sure that that's the way, at least the clinicians that talk to me, suggest that work occurs. But these are bright folks who need to be at the table. I don't buy that the sustainability of these things is limited because of cost. I just showed you two models where, okay, in New York City, there's a critical mass, there's economies of scale. I appreciate that. But I'm not so sure. I think the cost is a herring sometimes, because while it may need an initial investment, at the end of the day, the costs, the cost of doing these things. You have to have an unbelievably narrow view of public safety to think that the cost of doing this isn't a lot less than the cost of doing that. And so I would urge you all to, I mean, maybe it's the policy group that Dr. Elliott and Sharon have put together. Maybe it is the Blueprints Policy Group. I think that these discussions have to take place. But, and you know, everybody thinks they're always living in a critical moment. I'm not so sure about that. I talked before about, I don't know about the shelf life. But I do know, particularly when I look at justice, and I look at 10%, and I think how ripe this world is. I mean, please invite me to your county. I'll come talk. I mean, if we can't convince them of that this is the way to go. I mean, we created a little group called the Implementation Support Center that was actually initially created to help the New York City agencies for free familiarize themselves with evidence-based practices because we wanted more choir members. We knew at the end of the day, if only the Foundling singing this song, ultimately the music's going to stop, right? So we created this Implementation Support Center, and going back to my intermediary, and this is where I diverted a little bit, for sustainability on these intermediaries, I was at a session yesterday, and I just disagree. I actually think, while our interest is in going to Detroit and going to Chicago or going to wherever they want to do this, I think intermediaries go in, help, they set it up, and they get out. Because here's the problem. If Chicago doesn't own Chicago, if Detroit doesn't own Detroit, there'll be no sustainability. So I think these intermediary agencies go in and they help set up. You leave at an appropriate point, and we'll have metrics as to what those appropriate points are. I mean, you can measure fidelity, you can measure all sorts of things. But I don't think they should stay forever, because then it's not that towns, then it's not that jurisdictions. And the next budget cuts, well, you're not the employees, your contracts, the contract can go. It needs to be built into the local culture. So I'm sensitive about this blueprint thing, and I'm conflicted. We have to have rules. We certainly have to have rules, or we'll be back to the same old mashed potatoes that got us into the situation that we found ourselves in before this fine work started. I don't know what all those rules will be. I don't know. I mean, some jurisdictions have done things to incentivize. I mean, the state of Washington has taken an interesting approach. There's incentives that you can provide. But at some point, I don't think we, who probably most of us use the taxpayers' money, can just take that taxpayers' money and say, well, we do this because we've always done it and it feels good and we just know it works. Well, that's just not enough anymore, folks. It's just not enough to say that. So my final word will be on universities. And Stephen Felipe actually mentioned this yesterday, and he's a professor, I think, at LSU. The universities really have a role. And I don't mean the academics in the universities doing the research. I mean the university teachers who actually are teaching the social work students and so forth. You know, they have been AWOL on this stuff. AWOL. We have a nice relationship in New York City, and that's not the case there. We have a great relationship with Hunter College, which produces more MSWs for the agencies, and Fordham College, Columbia, and NYU. A little bit different. NYU, very, very clinical. Columbia tends to be more policy. But the universities have to take some responsibility. They have to have some role in this. They have to. There's a legitimacy that the universities bring to it. It also would allow their students to make clearer decisions, more informed decisions about what they want to get into. This child welfare work, this stuff is hard. This is hard as hell. We were scaring 20% of our caseworkers weren't even lasting a year because, you know what, they're walking the streets at midnight in Bedford-Stuyvesant or in East Harlem. This work is hard. The least we can do is provide them with the skills to create those relationships with those that they serve. So it's an ongoing dialogue with the universities. But at least in New York City, I'm hopeful. But I would certainly urge all of you, depending upon where you are in the evolution of your role in evidence-based practice, reach out to the universities. Because I do find after you reach out, they tend to be receptive. They tend to be a little insular. So if you don't reach out to them, they're not going to reach out to you. And I think that they'll see that they too have something at stake here. So I hope I answered a few of your, I was only kidding before when I said I didn't want to answer any of your questions, but I do hope that you're leaving with more of them, and I can tell that by looking at some of your faces that you probably are. I'm open for questions and answers. I'm sorry for the informality of this, but it's I think a conversation is the important thing to have here. I'm not smart enough to give you 27 lists of things to do, but I think it's the richness and the nuance of the relationships that you have with one another and you have with the people that you serve. That's where the true knowledge emerges from. So, thank you very much. Yes. Now, I forgot everything I said, so...
Thank you. You said beware of cultural sensitivity issue.
Yes.
I didn't understand what you said about that. I wonder if you could go into it a little bit more.
Sure you don't want to talk about my mother and father and their drug of choice?
I know this is harder.
Oh no, yeah. Okay, so let me take it on. I mean, I have found no evidence and listen, I don't get a lot of joy out of sitting down and reading these damn clinical studies. That's not what I do. I have found no evidence in any of these studies, nor in the work that we actually do at the Foundling, that there's a cultural bias inherent in either their development or their application as I've seen it. Now, I'm not saying, and I'm not saying that there's not a caseworker that works for the Foundling today, actually, who could be in Harlem, right, with a Haitian family that doesn't appreciate the relationship between the husband and the wife as being different than it might if they were over in Queens and they were in a Polish family's home. I'm not talking about that, nor am I saying that we always that we always get it right. What I'm saying is there seems, to my mind, my reading of it, no systematic bias in these interventions on that dimension.
And so when you said be aware of the cultural sensitivity issue, what did you mean by be aware of it?
Okay,
yeah.
I actually, and you know what, this happened just last week. Here, and I'm sorry for not answering, because it would have been easier if I just answered the question the way you asked it. This just happened last week, and I won't say to whom. But it was at one of the New York universities, one of the major New York universities. And a statement was made, oh, this is just a box. This is a one-size-fits-all. That's what this is all about. And they were leading with this notion of these interventions are not culturally sensitive to the needs of whatever population you might be serving. And again, you know what? Listen, I love conspiracies. I love this stuff because it's interesting and it gets me going. I just haven't found it here, and I just don't see the systematic bias that others imply. And here's why I said beware. If you share my belief in it, I actually do think it's one of the reasons people use for not pursuing an evidence-based practice. That's my reason for beware. Now, if you're in a community that you don't think is very culturally sensitive, you've got to beware for a lot of other reasons, and you need to address that. But I don't think it comes with the interventions. I think it actually comes with the culture of the organization that employs the folks that are going to be using the interventions. That's my own take.
Thank you.
Wow. I don't know how to... Oh, yes.
Okay, so along the cultural sensitivity line.
Oh, my God. With all this other... No, go ahead. Go ahead. I understand.
Yeah, well, I'm wondering if you've found any sort of training or practices that support the development of those skills to engage those different types of families within the context of MST and FFT. if we're starting to build sort of a body of knowledge around how we work in very diverse urban ecologies, so that we are sort of being culturally sensitive and engaging, with such diverse populations.
I'm going to make something up. No, I would say basically, primarily no to your question, but let me say what I think we do. And again, it's my mindset that I don't think it's inherent in the interventions. So it's between my relationship and our relationship with our staff. So our staff go through a bunch of training around this, and thank God for ACS. It's a big deal at ACS, at the Administration for Children's Services. And if you'd ask, I don't know if any current, if you ask somebody, they're not happy where we are as agencies. I'm comfortable, though, that we spend enough time with our caseworkers to sensitize them to these issues. I mean, there's different, particularly in a place like New York City, I mean, there's different attitudes about punishment. There's different attitudes about school. There's all sorts of differences that you can tie to different cultural beliefs. So our staff are sensitized to that, but no more so if they're doing MST or FFT or MTFC than they would be if they were doing BSFT.
Thank you. I'm working in Miami, and you know that Miami is a very different country than even Florida. So, it's very different. So it's a similar question. It's not about cultural sensitiveness, but it's about the strategic way that when you need to do something very important, you change completely the idea. You jumped out of the circle and you do innovation, as the way that you mentioned you did in New York. That the change is not within, but doing something very different. So the question is, if you know better all the approaches and all the blueprints. Evidence-based programs. Do you think that the developers are going to think in something like that, like a jump out of the circle and do something about something different to contextually be in each of the states?
I don't know, and I don't think we can speak for all of the developers. I think they have different views of this. I don't think they all agree. In some respects, I really don't care. Much of this is now part of the cumulative knowledge base, and I think there's an obligation to share. If they don't want to be part of that, if in fact we can respect their intellectual property rights, which they deserve, they developed it. I haven't created a darn thing. They created it. So I think it's a balance. I think I haven't met a developer who wouldn't be interested, if they thought that their interests could be protected, who wouldn't want to see every darn kid get the kind of service that, whether it is MST or FFT or MTFC or actually, Barry Glick and I work together at the Division for Youth, and I see ART is a best practice. I mean, I've known it for some time, but I hadn't thought about Barry until I saw that here. So I don't. Here's what it is. I don't think that the developers are not the enemy in this. In fact, they're the friends, hopefully the co-conspirators. I'm saying we're kidding ourselves if we go home thinking that the developers are taking this thing to scale. It is not happening. It's just not going to happen. Yes. Oh.
If I understand you correctly, you're saying that there is no inherent bias in some of these so-called evidence-based intervention. And I may have misunderstood, but it came to some degree in a mocking way. When we talk about cultural sensitivity and developing an intervention, we need a sample. And that sample needs to include individuals from a variety of ethnic and racial backgrounds. Not all of those interventions include minority. A lot of them in the past were developed only with Caucasian kids and apply to minority populations. That's a reality. That's not a conspiracy theory. So we have to be mindful and sensitive when we talk about that, because it's the truth. It's the history. So when an intervention is developed and it's called evidence-based, is not bulletproof and is not universal. So it doesn't apply to every single child out there and every single family, no matter how quote-unquote sensitive the staff that is implementing that intervention is. So I really wanna bring that point and be mindful of that in a respectful way to a lot of children that receive interventions that were not sensitive. And another aspect that is also truth is that some of these interventions are expensive and someone is making profit out of them. That's just the fact. So I think that everybody has good intentions and everybody feels strongly about kids and minorities, but we also have to be truthful and realistic about the flaws of some of these interventions and the fact that in order to be sensitive, it's not only the staff that have to be trained, but the sample used to develop the norms and run those statistical analyses to determine that this is quote-unquote evidence-based need to include a sample that includes people from different walks of life and racial backgrounds and so forth. Does that make sense?
Wow. Do you like apple pie? And yeah. I mean, yeah. Unequivocally, it makes sense. I guess you and I might disagree the extent to which it's been absent or present in some of these things. But does it make sense? Without a doubt. And in fact, that should be a golden rule. Now, I happen to believe it's more present than you might think. But that's okay. I mean, those are differences. But yes, sign me up. I think everything that you said should be present in all that we do. I just currently think it probably is more so than you might, but I'm with you. Without a doubt. Without a doubt. Yeah.
Thank you for your very rich and informing presentation. It gave a blueprint for many of us who are advocating for interventions, be it the ones that you're advocating or others. So my question, back to your last point, had to do with engaging universities to infuse evidence-based programs and practices, because these are our future policymakers, our future. They're going to start out as practitioners, but many will move into policymakers. So who are the organizations that you would recommend we target? I mean, I've personally targeted the National Council on Family Relations to move them from strictly research to more of a practitioner level, because they work with 127 universities on promoting family life education, meaning family life education as a prevention tool for juvenile justice and behavioral health issues. But what are some of the other agencies that you think?
Yeah, I guess depending upon who you represent and are affiliated with, you'd strike at the appropriate level. In New York City, we go right at the universities. We go directly at the universities because universities are notoriously independent, and universities go out of their way to distinguish themselves from other universities. And so we go right to them. I mean, I think as many associations that exist, and I'm not steeped in what the education associations are, we go right at it. We go right to the source, and for us, we start in the School of Social Work. And we spend a lot of time with them, and we've gotten them to buy in. Now, the next step is curriculum, right? How do curriculums change? And then, I mean, the Foundling, actually Children's Village, where Mona is, actually, they sponsor a fellowship, an internship at Hunter, a graduate internship. So you can have evidence-based internships. There's a couple of different ways that you can do it. But I do think there is when we see therapists come right out of school and start the job, there's a disconnect that doesn't have to exist. There's always going to be a gap because that's a university and this is the street. But I'm not so sure the gap has to be what we've seen it to be in New York City. So we go right at the schools. Yes.
I have the mic. So you never got back to the MST results. You kept teasing us. Yes. MST results.
Okay. Let me tell you about those MST results. And Scott Hengler say, I told you so, I told you so, I told you so. And those of you who attended Mona's presentation yesterday, because Mona actually let the cat out of the bag yesterday talking about Children's Village, because we had chosen them to be one of the implementers of MST, along with, some of you may have heard of Berkshire Farms. That was the other agency that I chose up in Albany to do it. So, unbelievable. Scott's results could have been added. All we had to do was put another column on that elegant one-pager I told you about. His results were just about the same, using it on the back end. Which, lesson learned, folks. We knew it going in. We did it because of where we were. We had to change the conversation. We were starting from scratch. We knew it was a silly idea. And as Scott told us, again, he laughed so hard he fell off his chair just about. And he told us it wasn't going to work, and he was right. So the results were not very good. But here's the interesting thing, and here's timing, right? Good timing in this case. By the time those results were public, the bus in many ways had left the station, and there were too many other people who had used the evidence-based practices in New York the right way, who were showing results that really kind of mitigated the results from the one inappropriate use of it.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about systems change and possibly the role of evidence-based prevention programs, because MST, FFT, they're interventions, but when you think about systems change, maybe that involves preventing youth from getting to the point where they even might need these services.
Yes, I can, and let me tell you a little sensitivity, and this goes back even to some things Brian said yesterday. I'm not a very smart guy, so I'm an 80-20 guy. If I can get 80% of the population, it takes us years to get to the other 20, so be it, an 80-20 guy. So I focus on child welfare and juvenile justice, right? Because in my world, that's even more than 80%. I actually think the FFT and the MST to a less extent, but for a more nuanced case, a more complicated case. But FFT, like I said to you, we are using it across child welfare. I mean, for families with 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 5-year-olds. So we're actually using it in what ACS would term preventive. Now, as Dr. Elliott changed a few years ago this, and I think a very, very, very smart thing to do, from delinquency prevention to healthy youth development, I'd be leery of spreading this stuff out too far and applying it where it doesn't need to be applied. Because while it's less expensive than residential care or foster care, it's not more expensive than a basketball league, which is probably going to suffice for 80% of the kids. So I think we have to be careful about how we apply it. So within child welfare prevention, we use it. We use it for all 600 cases that we serve. The idea of how it overlays in a general population, I'm not sure, but I see you shaking your head, so I didn't answer. No, I didn't mean basketball programs as an agent of change. I just meant that, like, Keller's son is a star athlete. We all like to play basketball just as part of growing up, just generally youth development. Most of our kids, I mean, we get a little too insular. Most of the kids out there are doing okay. And I would be, not the kids that we might work with, but most of the kids are doing okay. I would be reluctant to start to use these interventions to extend beyond to kids whose risk and protective factors haven't been identified as needing a little bit more help. Now, some general common sense stuff. I mean, look at the bullying stuff. Right? The bullying stuff is pretty straightforward stuff that schools all should employ across the board. But I'd be a little worried about focusing too heavy on kids who just generally growing up is going to be, things are going to be okay. Sorry.
No, we are at that point. And I think we really need to thank Bill for a terrific presentation. So let's give him a hand. That was great. Thank you. I did want to make just 2 comments, given the question around the cultural sensitivity issue. I agree with what Bill said. We always have to be concerned about those kinds of cultural differences. And I think it's important that we have, in fact, been doing research on that, trying to always make sure because as was stated, many of these programs were developed on Caucasian white populations, boys rather than girls, and that's true. And so I think we always need to be looking for those kinds of differences. The good news is that these interventions turn out to be very robust across those kinds of gender, racial, ethnic differences. There are cases where that is not true, and you have to be aware of that. But the good news is that they are far more robust than what we thought. And there's a lot of research to back that up, and if you want to see that, I'd be happy to provide that. The second thing is, I don't know, Bill, about modifying FFT to FFT-CW, and implementing that, except that you're doing an evaluation. That's my rule. If you aren't using an evidence-based program, you've got to evaluate what you do. So you're off the hook. We are right on time, so we are excused, and we've got 15 minutes to network, get another cup of coffee. Sessions start in 15 minutes at 10:15. Thank you.